Every society in human history produced them. Witch, heretic, madman. The names change every century. The function never does. Because the outsider isn't a naturally occurring phenomenon, they are produced by the very societies that claim to protect themselves from them. And once you understand how this production process works, you can never look at an outcast the same way again. Let's start with a question that seems simple but isn't. What does it mean to be normal? Not in a statistical sense, in a social sense, with consequences. In a social sense, normal means this: safe, belonging, not a threat. Normal means the group won't turn against you. And the line between normal and not normal is never fixed. It moves. It's drawn and redrawn by those who hold the power to draw it. And the people who end up on the wrong side of that line rarely chose to be there. They were placed there. The witch trials are the most instructive example in Western history. Between 1450 and 1750, between 40,000 and 60,000 people were executed in Europe on charges of witchcraft. Approximately 75 to 80% of them were women. Most were poor, many were elderly. A disproportionate number were widows, women who owned property but had no man to legitimize that ownership. This was not a coincidence. The witch was not a random target. She was a very specific social type, a woman existing outside the structures that normally contained women. No father, no husband, no son. A woman with knowledge the church didn't sanction. A woman for whom the system had no category. She wasn't executed because she was dangerous. She was executed because she was unreadable. The system had no place for her. And instead of creating a place, the system created a crime. The author of the Malleus Maleficarum, the Witch Hunter's Handbook, Heinrich Kramer, was himself investigated by the church for irregular conduct. The Faculty of Theology at Cologne rejected his book entirely, condemning it as recommending unethical and illegal procedures. He forged or manipulated approvals he never truly received. By any reasonable assessment, the more dangerous figure in this story was him, but he had institutional power. She didn't. That is the entire story. It always was. The heretic threatened something more dangerous than the social order. They threatened the intellectual order. The heretic said, "Your truth is not the only truth. The authority that claims to speak in God's name may be speaking in its own." Giordano Bruno was burned in Rome in 1600, not because he said the earth orbits the sun. Copernicus said that and died in his bed. Bruno rejected the Trinity. He rejected the divine nature of Christ. He imagined a universe far too vast, too infinite, for any institution to define or contain, and he refused to take back any of it. For 7 years he was given the opportunity to recant. He didn't. In the end, on February 17th, 1600, in the Campo dei Fiori, he was burned with his tongue bound for his wicked words. Jan Hus was burned at the Council of Constance in 1415 for arguing the church had become corrupt. A century later, Martin Luther said almost the same things. Luther survived. Hus didn't. The difference wasn't the content of the argument. It was the political moment and the protection of powerful patrons. Heresy was never primarily a theological category. It was always a political one. The heretic isn't the person who is wrong. The heretic is the person who is right at the wrong time, in the wrong place, without the right protection. The figure of the madman reveals the most, because madness exposes the arbitrariness of the categories we use to classify people. Drapetomania was a mental illness diagnosed by an American physician in 1851. Its primary symptom was the desire of enslaved people to escape. Hysteria, a diagnosis applied almost exclusively to women for over 2,000 years, defined emotional expressiveness, sexual autonomy, resistance to authority, refusing to fulfill the role expected of a woman. For most of its history, the treatment was institutional confinement. Homosexuality remained in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the official psychiatric classification, until 1973. These were not medical failures. They were diagnostic failures of a very specific kind, cases where the disorder being treated wasn't in the patient. It was in the society's inability to contain them. The madman isn't someone whose mind is broken. The madman is someone whose mind refuses to take the shape the world decided minds should take. What connects the witch, the heretic, and the madman isn't what they did, it's what they represented. They represented the possibility that the world could be otherwise, that categories are not natural, that boundaries are not inevitable, that those in power are not in power because they deserve to be, but because they have successfully convinced everyone that the alternative is unthinkable. The outsider makes the alternative thinkable, and that is why the outsider must be eliminated, not because they are a practical threat, but because they are a conceptual one. Philosopher Michel Foucault spent his career mapping this process. Every society requires an outside, a boundary that defines the inside, and that outside must be populated, must be made visible, must be periodically renewed. The trial isn't really about the defendant, it's about the audience, a public performance of the boundary, a demonstration of what happens to those who cross it. Execution, burning, institutional confinement, these are not punishment, they are lessons. Every mechanism described above is still operating. The categories changed, the language changed, the institutions changed, but the underlying process, the identification of an outsider, the construction of a narrative that makes them threatening, the social consensus that something must be done, that process is the same. Every age produces its own witch, its own heretic, its own madman. The question is never whether your society is doing this. The question is who it's being done to, and whether you're close enough to the center to never notice.